When trying to cure heat soak in a carburetor, one of the most popular options is to use a heat insulating spacer. But obviously, they're not all created equal. There are some that work better on other intake manifolds and some that don't. So let's talk about which one's best for you. So heat soak is a very common problem on aftermarket carburetors, especially the aluminum bodied stuff, because it absorbs heat very well. In aluminum transfers heat very well. So if you've got an aluminum intake manifold, or if you've got a steel manifold and an aluminum based carburetor, it will accept heat very easily. And that's where spacers come in. We've talked about this quite a bit over the years. Definitely talked about the different types of ways you can help cure that. I did a whole video on how you can help cure the heat soak problem on carburetors. And the spacers are the best way to do that. But they're not all the same. They're not all designed to work universally. So you have to kind of match these up a little bit. Now, obviously, they are specific. This one is for a quadrajet style carburetor, so it's obviously very unique to that design. Quadrajet bolts right onto it, and it generally follows the intake manifold and the holes that are there for that manifold. But what do you do with an aftermarket manifold like a Performer, the Performer RPM, any of the wont intakes? Doesn't matter what it is, they all have their way of delivering the fuel and air mixture down into the runner and down into the cylinder head. So we need to talk a little bit about that because, like I say, there is some reasons why you wouldn't use one of these over the other. So let's do this. Let me get a couple of intake manifolds up here on the bench and we'll show you what the differences are in between them. Before we get started on that, let's talk about these adapters that go from a spread bore style manifold so you can bolt up a square bore style carburetor. We're not talking about these. These are very specific. They're an adapter to go from that type of carburetor to that type of intake manifold. But also, too, these are aluminum, so they're going to transfer heat very, very well off of a steel or an aluminum intake manifold, whatever the case may be. It will transfer it very easily up into aluminum carburetor. So any aluminum spacer or adapter is not a good way to block heat. So these we're not talking about. It's just the regular spacers. So just want to point that out before we get any further into the video. Now, one thing this doesn't really pertain to is these 1/4 inch thick heat insulator gaskets. Got little grommets in it. They just aren't that big of a consideration. There's not enough surface area thickness to it to affect the airflow going through there, which is really what we're talking about here when we talk about matching up the spacer of the intake. So when you're talking about these, don't worry about it. You can use them on either style intake. Now let's talk about the spacers. Obviously, if you've watched my video on curing heat soak, I am a very big fan of these wood laminate spacers. I do believe they block the heat a little bit better than, say, the phenolic plastic. That is just my estimation, my guesstimation of things. There may be some scientific ways to back that or refute that. But anyway, I do prefer the wood laminate we're talking about. But for this discussion, it really doesn't matter. Now onto the spacers. Obviously, with an open plenum style, that will go right on an open plenum style intake, and that's what it's designed to do. Space itself off the intake manifold, help block the heat. Open plenum, so the fuel and air mixture flows through there the same way. I don't like these really low profile, the 1x the Torker by Edelbrock. They're really not that good of intake manifolds, but what they are good for is keeping the under hood clearance down, especially on Corvettes. Those guys suffer big time for not having enough space under hood, but that's the way that's designed to go. Now, I don't have the regular split runner spacer, but I do have this 4-hole one, and if that's all you have, you can run that on a Performer style intake manifold, which is what this one is for a small block Ford. Now, here's where we get into an area where things become a little more complicated. If you use that open style spacer on a split or a stock style intake manifold, the rule of thought is that does not work very well. The carburetor tends to mix the fuel and air coming through there. It doesn't find the right pathway as easy, and running a split or a 4-hole on a factory style or on that type of manifold that has those is the best way to do it. The thought is just that uneven air and fuel distribution, which I can certainly see. I don't have any way to prove that. The only way we could prove that is to bolt something something on top of it and not run, probably fuel and air through, but you could use like a smoke machine and push that through there and see what the volume is, or at least visual the volume coming out of the runners. So maybe that would be a way to test it. But the other side of that is, from what the experts say, is that we'll tend to pool or puddle fuel at the bottom of the manifold there. But honestly, I think that's probably more for a stock style intake manifold. These aftermarket ones, I don't know. I have run a open spacer on this type of manifold over and over and over again, and I haven't really noticed any loss of throttle response. Now, also the thought being that if you run a regular 4-hole or a split spacer on there, that you will have better throttle response. I don't know that I have ever experienced that feeling, but that's all that is. There's really no way to measure that. You could AFR that and just see if there's any variance between these two, but boy, that would be such a small number. I don't know that you'd come up with anything, at least for the hundreds of hours that I have staring at an AFR gauge with stuff like this. I don't know that that would make such an impact. If the carburetor's tuned really well, I don't know that it makes that big of a difference. So really, could you run that spacer on both intake manifolds? I say yes, you can. I've done it, again, thousands of times, never had any issues with it. Could you run just a regular 4-hole spacer on an open plenum type intake? Sure, I don't think that that has probably any effect on it at all. The thought process being that when you run it on that style of intake manifold, or a stock intake that has those very divided runners in it, that it will enhance that low end torque, and maybe you'd enhance a little bit of it. But again, we're talking if it's 1 foot-pound of torque that thing would enhance. I don't know that you'd ever feel that or notice that. You certainly wouldn't notice it if you took it away. So it's kind of six or one, half a dozen another. But when it comes down to, if this was a stock intake manifold and you were bolting on an adapter to be able to adapt a spread bore style pad to a square bore style carburetor, then absolutely, if you're going to run a heat blocking spacer, and absolutely recommend that you do so, use the correct spacer. In this case, run the 4-hole. That way everything lines up with it. You don't lose any of that effectiveness with it. If you were to run a open plenum, then you can see where you can kind of run into some issues here. Fuel air kind of hits those and doesn't really follow that nice clean path down into the intake manifold and into the runner down into the cylinder head. So if you're going to run a spacer on a stock intake, run that 4-hole adapter or spacer to block the heat. It'll absolutely work much better. Now on the 2101 Performer intake pictured here, you cannot run this 4-hole divided or this open spacer with it onto that intake manifold because it will leak. What you'll need is the adapter plate, and I'll leave the part numbers to all of this stuff down in the description so you can find it. But first you need to seal up the intake first, and then you can run the spacer that you want. One last little thing that we've obviously talked about quite a bit in the past, but when you're talking about spacers to block heat, run the thickest one you can. Now, typically the inch ones you can run on most everything, but like on the GMC where I've got a lot of room under hood, I could run this 2-inch one very easily and really help isolate the carburetor from the heat source, which is the engine. So don't worry about it. You'll hear people argue, well, you'll gain velocity and you'll get a lot more top end power if you run that bigger 2-inch spacer. Probably, but again, are you going to feel a 3 horsepower, 4 horsepower change at 6,500 RPM? Probably not. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. Concentrate on what the design of the product is supposed to do, and that's block the heat from reaching the carburetor. So just one last little tip on that: run the thickest one you can. So I think that covers pretty much everything at this point. Just be careful, like I say, when you're trying to match up the intake manifold with the spacer, just match it up with the correct one. Sometimes that means the open plenum, sometimes it's a 4-hole, sometimes it's a regular divided one, whichever one fits best. But In the worst case scenario where you just need it to work for a little bit of time on an aftermarket intake manifold, that open hole spacer will work just fine until you can get the correct one on there. So I wouldn't worry too much about it. Really, the big benefit is blocking the heat from the engine to the carburetor. So if I forgot anything, if I should have included any more information, leave it in the comments down below. Happy to answer any of those questions. And certainly if you've got any other questions on fitment, don't hesitate. Again, I'll leave all this stuff linked in the description so you can find it there. So that's what we got today, and hopefully you learned something, and hopefully help you figure out your project. So anyway, we'll talk to you guys on the next one. We'll see you.